The morning sun peeked through Frank Thompson's bedroom window, casting a warm glow on the collection of medals displayed on his dresser. At 93, Frank moved slower than he used to, but his military discipline never wavered. Every morning at exactly 6:30 a.m., he would wake up, make his bed with hospital corners just like he learned in the army, and start his day. Frank lived alone in his modest two-story house on Maple Street, the same house he and his beloved wife, Martha, had bought 50 years ago. Martha had passed away 2 years earlier, leaving Frank with a lifetime of memories and a garden she had loved dearly. The garden became his sanctuary, a place where he could feel close to her while tending to the colorful flowers and vegetables she had planted. His neighbors often saw him working in the garden, his wrinkled hands carefully pulling weeds and watering the plants. Despite his age, Frank stood tall, his white hair always neatly combed, and his clothes pressed and clean. The small American flag pin on his jacket was as much a part of his daily outfit as his comfortable walking shoes. Every morning after his garden work, Frank would walk the 3 blocks to Joe's Diner for his breakfast. The walk took him 15 minutes now, though it used to take only 5 in his younger days. He used a wooden cane, not because he couldn't walk without it, but because Martha had insisted he use one after his hip surgery 5 years ago. Even after she was gone, he kept using it, honoring her loving concern. Joe's Diner was more than just a place to eat for Frank. It was where he met his friends, shared stories, and felt connected to the community. Joe Martinez, the owner, was the son of Frank's old army buddy, and he always kept Frank's favorite booth ready, the one by the window where the morning light was perfect for reading his newspaper. "Morning, Frank," Joe would call out every day, already pouring Frank's coffee, black with 1 sugar, before the old veteran could even sit down. "The usual?" Frank would smile and nod, settling into his booth while Joe prepared his breakfast. 2 eggs over easy, wheat toast, and a side of crispy bacon. The other regular customers loved having Frank around, especially the children who stopped by with their parents before school. "Tell us a story, Mr. Thompson," they would beg, and Frank's eyes would light up. He never told them the scary parts of war, instead sharing stories about friendship, bravery, and helping others. The children would listen with wide eyes as he described how he and his fellow soldiers would share their chocolate bars with kids in the villages they passed through, or how they would help farmers rebuild their barns. Back home, Frank spent his afternoons organizing his photographs and letters from the war. He kept them in careful order in albums and boxes, each item labeled with dates and names. These weren't just memories, they were pieces of history. Sometimes, local school teachers would invite him to speak to their classes about World War II, and Frank would carefully select appropriate photos to share with the students. His evenings were quiet but pleasant. Frank would sit in his favorite armchair, the one next to Martha's empty seat, and watch the news or read books about history. Sometimes, he would write letters to his old war buddies who were still alive. There weren't many left now. They would exchange updates about their lives, share memories, and comfort each other about the friends they had lost. Before bed each night, Frank would look at the photograph of Martha on his nightstand. It was taken on their 50th wedding anniversary, just 6 months before she passed away. Her smile still brightened his day, even from a photograph. "Good night, my dear," he would whisper, a routine that helped him feel less alone in the big house. The neighborhood children called him Grandpa Frank, and he enjoyed their visits after school. They would help him in the garden, and in return, he would share cookies that he baked using Martha's old recipe. He wasn't as good a baker as she had been, but the kids never complained. Life was simple but meaningful for Frank Thompson. He had his routines, his memories, and his place in the community. At 93, he had seen more of life than most, and he was content with his quiet existence. Little did he know that his peaceful life was about to face an unexpected challenge, one that would require him to draw upon all his years of experience and wisdom to overcome. The changes began on a Tuesday morning. Frank was sitting in his usual booth at Joe's Diner when the first rumble of motorcycles shook the windows. At first, he thought it was just a group passing through town, but the noise didn't fade away. Instead, it got louder. Across the street from Joe's Diner stood Old Pete's Auto Repair, which had been empty for the past 2 years. Now, the rusty garage doors were wide open, and a group of leather-clad bikers was moving in. Their motorcycles gleamed in the morning sun, but their loud engines and rough laughter disrupted the usual peaceful atmosphere of the street. Joe Martinez walked over to Frank's table, coffee pot in hand, his forehead creased with worry. They bought the place last week, he said, topping off Frank's cup. Some motorcycle club called the Steel Dragons. The mayor says it'll be good for business, but he trailed off, watching as more bikers arrived. Frank noticed immediate changes in the following days. The morning crowd at Joe's Diner started to thin out. Parents who usually brought their children for breakfast before school chose different routes. The loud music and constant motorcycle noise from the garage made it hard for people to enjoy their meals or hold conversations. The bikers seemed to take over the street. They parked their motorcycles wherever they wanted, often blocking the sidewalk. Frank had to walk on the road to get around them, which was dangerous with his cane. When he politely asked them to move their bikes, they just laughed and ignored him. One morning, Frank counted 15 motorcycles parked outside the garage. Their owners were working on bikes, drinking beer, and playing loud music despite it being only 9 a.m. As he walked past, trying to keep his usual pace to the diner, one of the younger bikers nudged his friend and pointed at Frank. "Hey, Grandpa," the biker called out. "Need a ride? Bet it's faster than that snail's pace you're going." The others laughed, making engine noises and pretending to walk with invisible canes. Frank kept his head high and continued walking, just as he had done when facing much worse during the war. But inside, he felt a deep sadness. This was his neighborhood, his home for 5 decades, and now he felt like a stranger on his own street. The situation at Joe's Diner got worse. The bikers started coming in for lunch, taking up the biggest tables and being loud and rough. They left without tipping and sometimes forgot to pay their bills. Joe, usually cheerful and talkative, became quiet and worried. "My regular customers are staying away," Joe confided in Frank one morning, his voice low. "Business is down 30% since they moved in. I can't keep going like this, Frank. This diner was my father's dream, and now..." He wiped his eyes quickly with his apron. Frank watched as elderly Mrs. Peterson tried to enter the diner, but turned away when she saw 3 motorcycles blocking the entrance. The bikers sitting nearby just smirked and continued their loud conversation. Frank's hands tightened around his coffee cup, remembering how this diner had always been a safe, welcoming place for everyone. The neighborhood children stopped visiting Frank's garden after school. Their parents kept them inside, away from the noise and rough language coming from the garage. Frank's garden felt emptier without their cheerful voices and helping hands. One evening, as Frank sat in his armchair looking at Martha's photo, the sound of revving motorcycles filled the air. The bikers had started doing late-night motorcycle repairs, the noise making it impossible for anyone nearby to sleep. Frank watched from his window as other neighbors turned their lights on, some coming out to their porches to see what was happening. The local police drove by a few times, but they didn't do much. The bikers always turned down the music when the police cars appeared, only to turn it up again as soon as they left. Frank could see the frustration on his neighbors' faces, matched by his own feeling of helplessness. That night, as Frank lay in bed listening to the distant rumble of motorcycles, he realized that something needed to be done. The peaceful life he and his neighbors had enjoyed was slipping away. But at 93, what could he do against a group of tough, young bikers? As he drifted off to sleep, his military-trained mind began forming the first pieces of a plan. The tensions between Frank and the bikers grew worse with each passing day. The Steel Dragons seemed to take special interest in bothering the old veteran, perhaps because he was the only one who hadn't shown fear of them. Every morning, they would rev their engines extra loud when they saw him walking with his cane. Frank noticed how they watched him, pointing and laughing whenever he passed by. Some would imitate his careful walking style, dragging their feet and pretending to use imaginary canes. Even though Frank kept his face calm, inside he felt a mixture of sadness and anger. He hadn't faced such disrespect since returning from World War II. One particularly hot afternoon, Frank was tending to his garden when 3 bikers stopped their motorcycles right in front of his house. They sat there, engines running, filling the air with exhaust fumes that drifted over his beloved flowers. The petunias that Martha had planted were wilting in the toxic smoke. "Hey, old-timer," one of them called out. "Don't you think it's time to move to a retirement home? This neighborhood's changing." The others laughed, their motorcycles still rumbling loudly. Frank straightened his back, remembering his military training about staying calm under pressure. He continued watering his plants, acting as if the noise didn't bother him. This seemed to annoy the bikers even more. That evening, they started a new routine. Every night at 11 p.m., groups of bikers would ride up and down Frank's street, making as much noise as possible. The sound of roaring engines and loud music would echo between the houses, making it impossible for anyone to sleep. Other neighbors started complaining to the police, but nothing changed. Officer Jenkins, who usually patrolled the area, told Frank his hands were tied. "They're not technically breaking any laws," he explained apologetically. "And the mayor thinks having their business in town is good for the economy." The situation at Joe's Diner got even worse. The bikers now occupied most tables during breakfast time, Frank's usual quiet morning routine ruined by their loud voices and rough behavior. They would stare at him as he ate, sometimes making comments about dinosaurs and fossils. One morning, Frank found his newspaper in the diner soaking wet. He knew someone had purposely spilled coffee on it, but he couldn't prove who did it. Joe quickly brought him a new copy, his face red with anger, but both men knew confronting the bikers would only make things worse. "I'm losing all my regular customers," Joe whispered to Frank. "Even the morning coffee club has stopped coming. They're scared of these guys." The coffee club had been meeting at the diner for 20 years. Their absence showed how much the neighborhood had changed. The breaking point came when Frank discovered what they'd done to his mailbox. He went out one morning to find it knocked over, the post broken. Letters were scattered across his lawn, some torn and muddy. Among them were the last letters Martha had written to him when he was away at war, which he kept in a special box in the mailbox to read during his morning routine. As Frank carefully picked up the muddy letters, trying to save what he could of Martha's handwriting, he heard motorcycles approaching. A group of bikers slowed down as they passed, pointing and laughing at the destroyed mailbox. One of them revved his engine extra loud, spewing dirt onto the scattered letters. That night, Frank sat in his armchair, holding one of Martha's damaged letters. The paper was still damp, her beautiful handwriting smeared in places. Outside, he could hear the bikers' music blasting from their garage, mixed with the sound of revving engines and loud laughter. For the first time since Martha's passing, Frank felt truly alone. The neighborhood he had known and loved for 50 years was changing, and not for the better. His safe haven had become a place of stress and fear. Even the local children no longer came by to hear his stories or help in the garden. But as Frank sat there, listening to the chaos outside, something changed in his eyes. The sadness was replaced by a familiar look, the same determined expression he had worn during his military days when facing seemingly impossible situations. He reached for his old military trunk in the corner of the room, his hand steady as he opened it. Inside, beneath his uniforms and medals, lay his old tactical planning notebook from the war. Frank pulled it out, found a clean page, and began to write. The bikers had made a serious mistake in underestimating this 93-year-old veteran. They were about to learn that age and wisdom could be more powerful than noise and intimidation. Frank sat at his kitchen table early the next morning, his military notebook open before him. The sound of Martha's old clock ticking on the wall reminded him of how time was passing. His coffee grew cold as he studied the latest damage to his property through the window. The bikers had struck again overnight. His garden fence was spray-painted with crude words, and his American flag lay in the dirt, torn from its pole. But instead of the usual sadness, Frank felt something different today, a familiar sense of purpose he hadn't experienced since his war days. Walking to his bedroom, Frank opened the closet where he kept his old military trunk. Inside, beneath his carefully folded uniform, lay a box of photographs he hadn't looked at in years. These weren't the usual pictures he showed to schoolchildren. These were different, showing the strategic victories his unit had achieved during the war, the clever plans they had executed against much stronger enemies. As he spread the photos across his bed, memories flooded back. He remembered how his unit had once won against a larger force not through strength, but through careful observation and strategic thinking. "Know your enemy," his commanding officer used to say, "and you'll find their weakness." Frank picked up his cane and walked to Joe's Diner, arriving earlier than usual. He chose a different booth today, one with a clear view of the motorcycle garage across the street. Instead of reading his newspaper, he took out a small notebook and began watching the bikers as they arrived. Over his coffee and toast, Frank noted everything. He saw how the bikers arrived in specific groups, who led each group, and most importantly, who the others respected. He noticed that despite their rough behavior, they followed a strict hierarchy. The man they called Beast, a tall figure with a gray beard, was clearly their leader. Frank also observed something else, something that made him pause mid-ride. When a military convoy passed through town, several of the bikers straightened their posture unconsciously, some even offering subtle nods to the passing vehicles. Frank recognized that instinctive reaction. It was the same one he still had after all these years. During lunch, Frank visited the local library. Miss Thompson, the librarian, helped him search through recent newspapers and local news websites. He discovered that the Steel Dragons Motorcycle Club had chapters in several cities. Many of their members were veterans of recent conflicts, Iraq, Afghanistan, and other war zones. This information made Frank lean back in his chair, thinking deeply. These weren't just random troublemakers. They were soldiers. Different generation, different wars, but soldiers nonetheless. He understood something now that he hadn't before. Returning home, Frank found more vandalism. His garden chairs were overturned, and engine oil had been poured over his flower beds. The roses Martha had planted were dying in the contaminated soil. A group of bikers watched from across the street, laughing and pointing. But Frank didn't react the way they expected. Instead of showing anger or fear, he calmly took photographs of the damage. Then, to the bikers' surprise, he began cleaning up while whistling an old military tune. The caissons go rolling along. He noticed how some of the younger bikers stopped laughing, their expressions changing slightly at the familiar melody. That evening, Frank sat in his study with all his gathered intelligence spread before him, his observations, newspaper clippings, and photographs of the damage. His military training had taught him that every opponent had a weakness. The key was finding it and knowing how to use it. As night fell and the usual motorcycle noise began outside, Frank started forming his plan. It wouldn't be like his neighbor's failed attempts at calling the police or the angry confrontations that only made things worse. No, this would be different. A strategy that would use his age and experience as advantages rather than weaknesses. Looking at Martha's photo on his desk, Frank smiled for the first time in weeks. "You always said I was at my best when I had a mission, dear," he whispered. He opened his military notebook to a fresh page and began writing his battle plan. The bikers thought they were dealing with a helpless old man, but they were about to face a veteran who had outsmarted much more formidable enemies. Tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow, Frank Thompson would begin his carefully planned counteroffensive. Unlike any good military strategy, it would come from a direction the enemy least expected. Frank began executing his plan early the next morning. Instead of closing his curtains as he usually did, he left them wide open. In his front window, he carefully arranged his most impressive military medals and photographs. The morning sun made the bronze and silver decorations shine brightly, impossible to miss from the street. Among the displays was his Purple Heart, awarded for bravery under fire in Germany. Next to it stood a photograph of young Frank with his unit, standing proud after a successful mission. He positioned his silver star prominently, its citation clearly visible, describing how he had saved 3 fellow soldiers while under heavy enemy fire. The bikers noticed the display almost immediately. Frank watched through his window as they walked past, some slowing down to look at the medals. He could see their faces changing as they realized these weren't replica medals from a gift shop. These were real honors earned in combat. That afternoon, Frank took the next step in his plan. He brought out his old footlocker and began cleaning it on his front porch. Inside were more photographs, his combat badges, and carefully preserved maps from his campaigns. As he polished each item, he made sure to hold them where the afternoon sun would catch them. Beast, the motorcycle club's leader, rode past on his customized Harley. Frank pretended not to notice him slowing down, taking a long look at the military items spread across the porch. Frank simply continued his work, softly humming the Marine's hymn, just loud enough to be heard over the motorcycle's rumble. The next morning, Frank placed a new item in his window, his combat medic badge. Below it, he added a photograph of himself treating wounded soldiers in the field. More bikers stopped to look now, their conversations becoming quieter, more respectful. Some even pointed out details in the photographs to others. During his daily walk to Joe's diner, Frank noticed something different. The bikers who usually mocked his slow pace with the cane were quiet today. One of them, a younger member with a Marine Corps tattoo on his arm, even moved his motorcycle to clear the sidewalk before Frank reached it. Inside the diner, Frank overheard snippets of conversation from the bikers' table. They were discussing his medals, particularly the Silver Star. One of them mentioned his own uncle who had earned the same medal in Vietnam. Another spoke about his grandfather who had been a medic, just like Frank. Frank's next move was to bring out his old field radio. Though it no longer worked, he placed it on his porch table alongside his wartime field manual. He noticed how the bikers' eyes were drawn to these items, recognizing equipment similar to what they had used in their own service. That evening, Beast himself walked past Frank's house again, this time on foot. He stopped to study a particular photograph, one showing Frank's unit providing medical care to civilian children in a war-torn village. Frank watched through his window as the big man stood there, lost in thought. The next day, Frank added something new to his display, a collection of letters. These weren't Martha's letters, the ones he had received from soldiers he had treated on the battlefield. Each letter thanked him for saving their lives, for being there when they needed help most. He placed them carefully behind glass, their yellowed pages telling stories of brotherhood and sacrifice. The atmosphere in the neighborhood began to shift. The late-night motorcycle noise decreased. Some bikers would pause respectfully when passing Frank's house, looking at his ever-changing display of military history. A few even nodded in greeting when they saw him in his garden. One younger biker approached Frank as he was tending to his damaged flowers. The young man stood awkwardly for a moment before speaking. "Sir," he said quietly, "that Silver Star, was it from the Battle of the Bulge?" Frank looked up, seeing not a troublemaker, but a fellow soldier seeking connection. He noticed the man's military bearing, partially hidden under his leather jacket and tattoos. In his eyes, Frank recognized the same look he had seen in young soldiers during the war, a mix of toughness and hidden vulnerability. "Would you like to hear the story?" Frank asked, gesturing to his porch chairs. The young biker hesitated, then nodded. As they sat down, Frank could see other club members watching from across the street, their usual aggressive posturing replaced by curious attention. His plan was working better than he had hoped. The battle wasn't over yet, but Frank had successfully opened the first lines of communication with his enemy. The conversation on Frank's porch lasted longer than either he or the young biker expected. The young man, who introduced himself as Jake, listened intently as Frank shared the story of his Silver Star. Other bikers gradually drew closer, trying to appear casual but clearly interested in the old veteran's tale. "We were pinned down," Frank explained, pointing to a weathered photograph. "3 of our men were wounded in a ditch, and enemy fire was heavy. Someone had to get them out." His voice remained steady as he described crawling through mud under bullets to reach his wounded comrades. Jake leaned forward in his chair. "That's like what happened to my unit in Afghanistan," he said quietly. "We were trapped in a valley, taking fire from all sides." His tough exterior cracked slightly as he shared his own story, revealing the soldier beneath the biker vest. More members of the Steel Dragons drifted over as Jake and Frank talked. They stood at first, maintaining their distance, but soon some sat on the porch steps or leaned against the railing. Frank noticed how they unconsciously fell into military postures when discussing their service experiences. Beast, the club leader, watched from across the street. Frank could see him studying the scene, noting how his members were engaging with the old veteran they had been harassing just days before. When their eyes met, Frank gave him a respectful nod, soldier to soldier. The conversation shifted as more bikers shared their stories. One had served as a medic in Iraq, just as Frank had been a medic in World War II. Another had received a Bronze Star for valor. They found common ground in their experiences, different wars, same brotherhood. "You know," Frank said, gesturing to his vandalized garden, "my wife Martha planted these flowers. She kept this garden alive while I was overseas." He watched their faces change as they looked at the oil-stained soil and trampled plants with new eyes. Jake stood up suddenly, looking embarrassed. "Sir, we didn't know about any of this." He glanced at his fellow bikers, who shifted uncomfortably. "We just thought you were some grumpy old man who didn't like us in the neighborhood." Frank smiled gently. "And I thought you were just troublemakers. Seems we both had more to learn about each other." He reached for his photo album. "Would you like to see more pictures from my unit? We had our own ways of causing trouble back then." The afternoon turned into evening as Frank shared more stories. He brought out coffee and cookies, serving them on Martha's old tray. The bikers listened respectfully, asking questions about his service, his medals, and the men in the photographs. Some shared their own photos stored on their phones, images of desert operations and mountain patrols. Beast finally crossed the street as the sun was setting. The other bikers straightened up when he approached, but Frank remained seated, calmly pouring another cup of coffee. The big man stood silently for a moment, looking at the military displays in Frank's window. "That's a combat medical badge," Beast said, pointing to one of the medals. "My father earned one in Vietnam. Never talked much about it, but I know he saved a lot of lives." He turned to Frank, his tough expression softening slightly. "Just like you did, sir." Frank gestured to an empty chair. "Would you like some coffee?" Martha always said good coffee makes for better conversations. Beast hesitated, then sat down, his massive frame making the porch chair creak. As darkness fell, Frank's porch had become an unlikely gathering place. Veterans from different eras shared stories of service, sacrifice, and brotherhood. The generational gap between them seemed to shrink with each tale told. Before they left that evening, Jake looked at the damaged garden. He whispered something to Beast, who nodded in agreement. Other bikers gathered around them, speaking in low voices. Frank watched from his doorway as they mounted their motorcycles, but instead of the usual roaring engines and squealing tires, they rode away quietly, respectfully. Frank stood on his porch long after they'd gone, looking at his garden in the moonlight. For the first time in weeks, the neighborhood was peaceful, but somehow the silence felt different now, not like a temporary pause in hostilities, but like the beginning of something new. What Frank didn't know was that the Steel Dragons had their own plans forming. His strategy had worked better than he could have imagined, touching something deep in these younger veterans' hearts. Tomorrow would bring surprises that even his careful planning hadn't anticipated. Frank woke up early the next morning to an unusual sound, or rather, the lack of sound. The usual roar of motorcycles was missing. Instead, he heard voices and movement outside his house. When he looked out his window, he couldn't believe his eyes. The entire Steel Dragons motorcycle club was in his front yard, but not to cause trouble. They were working. Jake and several others were carefully removing the oil-soaked soil from Martha's garden, while others arrived in trucks carrying fresh soil and new plants. Beast himself was directing the operation like a military mission. "Morning, sir," Jake called out when Frank stepped onto his porch. "Hope we didn't wake you too early. We wanted to fix what we messed up." He gestured to the garden. "We got the same types of flowers your wife planted. The lady at the garden center helped us pick them out." Frank watched in amazement as the bikers worked with military precision. Some were repairing his broken fence, while others carefully replanted flowers following the original pattern they had observed in old photographs Frank had shown them. His vandalized mailbox had already been replaced with a new one, painted in patriotic colors. Around mid-morning, more motorcycles arrived, but these were different. Members from other chapters of the Steel Dragons had come after hearing about Frank. Many were veterans themselves, and they brought their own military photos and medals to share. Frank's porch became a gathering place for storytelling and coffee. Joe from the diner arrived with boxes of donuts and coffee for everyone. He could hardly believe the transformation. The same bikers who had been driving away his customers were now respectfully listening to Frank's stories about serving as a combat medic. Some shared their own experiences as modern-day military medics. "You know, sir," Beast said during a quiet moment, "we lost our way a bit. Forgot what it means to be veterans." He looked around at his club members. "We were acting like the kind of people we swore to protect others from." The transformation went beyond just Frank's property. The bikers began cleaning up the entire street, picking up trash, and helping elderly neighbors with yard work. Mrs. Peterson, who had been afraid to visit Joe's diner, found herself being escorted there by two respectful bikers who held the door for her. By afternoon, the garage across from Joe's diner had changed too. The bikers removed the offensive graffiti and hung up American flags. They even put up a special plaque declaring it a veteran-friendly establishment. The loud music was replaced by respectful conversation and the occasional sound of motorcycles being repaired. Frank shared more of his war photographs, including ones of him treating both soldiers and civilians. The bikers were especially moved by pictures of him helping children in war-torn villages. Jake revealed that he had done similar work in Afghanistan, providing medical care to local families. "That's what being a soldier really means," Frank said, looking at the photos. "Not just fighting, but protecting and helping others." The bikers nodded in agreement, some wiping away unexpected tears. Later that day, Beast gathered everyone in Frank's yard for an announcement. Starting today, he declared, the Steel Dragons have a new mission. We're going to honor what being a veteran means, and our first honorary member is going to help us remember that. To Frank's surprise, Beast pulled out a leather vest with the Steel Dragons patch. But this vest was special. It had Frank's name, rank, and World War II's service dates embroidered on it. On the back, above the club logo, were the words Honorary Road Captain, Combat Medic. Sir, Beast said, holding out the vest, would you do us the honor? Frank stood straight, his eyes moist as Jake and another biker helped him put on the vest. It fit perfectly over his usual cardigan, and somehow the combination didn't look strange at all. The entire club cheered and clapped. That evening, as the sun set, Frank sat on his porch looking at his restored garden. Martha would have loved the fresh flowers. The street was quiet, but not because of fear. The bikers were still there, but now their presence brought a sense of security instead of threat. A young neighbor boy, who had been afraid to visit for weeks, ran up to Frank's porch. Mr. Thompson, can you tell us a story? Behind him, more children approached, encouraged by their parents who now felt safe letting them visit the old veteran again. Frank smiled, noticing how Jake and some other bikers settled in to listen too. Well, he began, let me tell you about the time when being kind to your enemy turned out to be the strongest strategy of all. 6 months later, Frank's neighborhood had changed completely, but not in the way anyone had expected. The Steel Dragons Motorcycle Club had become an integral part of the community, with Frank as their guiding light and moral compass. Joe's diner was busier than ever. Every morning, Frank would arrive for breakfast to find his usual booth occupied by a mix of bikers and regular customers, all sharing coffee and conversation. The bikers had become unofficial security for the diner, ensuring no troublemakers disturbed the peace that had been established. Business is up 50%, Joe told Frank one morning, beaming as he poured coffee. And these guys are my best customers now. Who would have thought? He gestured to a table where Beast was helping an elderly woman with her heavy plate of breakfast. The garage across the street had transformed into a community center of sorts. While they still worked on motorcycles, the Steel Dragons had added a veterans support group that met twice a week. Frank attended every meeting, sharing his wisdom and experience with younger veterans struggling to adjust to civilian life. You helped us remember who we really are, Jake told Frank during one meeting. We were lost in anger, forgetting the brotherhood and service that made us soldiers in the first place. Other veterans nodded in agreement, many of them new members drawn to the club's reformed image. Frank's garden became a neighborhood attraction. The flowers Martha had loved now bloomed more beautifully than ever, tended not just by Frank, but by bikers who had discovered a surprising peace in gardening. They had even added a small memorial section with plants representing different military branches. Every Sunday, the Steel Dragons organized what they called Veterans Ride Day. They would carefully help Frank onto Beast's motorcycle, modified with a comfortable sidecar, and the entire club would escort him around town. Children would wave as they passed, and other veterans would join the procession, creating a weekly parade of brotherhood and respect. The local elementary school invited Frank and some of the bikers to speak about military service and veterans' experiences. The sight of the old veteran in his cardigan and leather vest, surrounded by respectful bikers, helped children understand that heroes come in all ages and appearances. Mr. Thompson taught us that true strength isn't about intimidation, Beast explained to the students. It's about wisdom, respect, and using your power to help others. The children listened intently, especially when Frank shared stories about treating wounded soldiers and helping civilians during the war. 1 year after the transformation began, the mayor organized a special ceremony. The Steel Dragons had become known throughout the region for their community service and veteran support programs. Other motorcycle clubs began following their example, creating a network of veteran-focused community groups. During the ceremony, Frank stood proudly in his vest as the mayor declared an official Veterans Unity Day. The Steel Dragons surprised him by unveiling a new scholarship in his name, designated for children of veterans pursuing medical careers. Frank Thompson showed us that it's never too late to make a difference, Beast announced to the gathered crowd. He could have responded to our disrespect with anger or fear. Instead, he used wisdom and understanding to turn enemies into family. That evening, Frank sat in his garden, surrounded by members of his unlikely new family. Young bikers listened attentively as he shared more stories from his military days. Children played safely in the street, occasionally running up to ask questions about the motorcycles or the flowers. Looking at Martha's photograph that he had brought outside, Frank smiled. "You would have loved this, dear," he whispered. "Your garden has more caretakers than ever now." As the sun set, the steel dragons started their motorcycles. But instead of the disruptive roar of the past, they rode away quietly, each one stopping to salute Frank before leaving. The noise that had once terrorized the neighborhood had been replaced by the sound of respect. Frank watched them go, his military medals gleaming in his window behind him. At 93, he had won perhaps his greatest victory, not through force or confrontation, but through understanding and wisdom. He had transformed a group of troubled veterans into a force for good, proving that sometimes the best strategy isn't to defeat your enemy, but to turn them into friends. The neighborhood settled into its evening peace, and Frank could hear children playing in the distance, their laughter mixing with the gentle purr of respectfully ridden motorcycles. His mission was complete, but his legacy was just beginning.